Hello everyone, and welcome to my Indie Retrospective. I'm Vicarious Brian, and I'm going to be walking you through some of the better and worst indie games of the past few years. With the Steam holiday sale almost upon us, I figured it'd be a good idea to sort of take a look back and get a catalog of some of the better games that you may have missed. I'm trying to specifically focus on the actual value that a lot of these games will be bringing us. A lot of the times when the Steam sales come up, it's hard not to buy at some of these prices. And yet, by the end of the sale, a lot of people don't play some of these games that they've bought. Yeah, it's only $2, $3, $4, $5 to buy these games, but if you're not going to play it, what's the point? This will be a two-part series, and today we're going to be looking at Cave Story Plus, Limbo, NightSky and Geometry Wars Retro Evolved. In my next video, we'll be looking at Dungeons of Dreadmore, Bastion, and Terraria. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, first up we have Cave Story Plus. It was originally made by a guy named Pixel over the course of about 5 years. It's an action platformer. Some people call it a Metroidvania. You wouldn't be too far off. There isn't so much of a focus on backtracking, but the way you do get new abilities throughout the course of the game is definitely reminiscent of like a Super Metroid. So it's been re-released on Steam as this Cave Story Plus. Of course, originally it was just Cave Story, and it was freeware. But over the last few years, we've definitely seen a lot of remakes and ports of this game. I believe the Wii was the first one, which got the first remake. The PC actually borrows, I believe, the graphics and the newer audio from the Wii version. The 3DS also actually, I believe, recently got its own version of Cave Story, another remake or a port of some of the Wii graphics. I'm not really sure how it works exactly. But as far as what actually sets the PC version aside, I guess there's an exclusive Wind Fortress level. I haven't seen it myself yet. I actually haven't beaten Cave Story Plus. I have beaten the original Cave Story, and I've beaten the remake on the Wii, but Cave Story Plus still eludes me. I do plan on finishing it at some point, though. As far as the Steam sale goes, I think that Cave Story Plus would be a solid buy, even at its asking price of $9.99. I've clearly enjoyed the previous versions. The Metacritic score is actually 83, I believe, so all in all, it's a good game. But Steam sale's coming, you have to be thrifty. I understand that. If it gets as low as $5 even, I think that's an easy buy. Although, I would assume it would hit at least $2.50 at its lowest. You gotta figure, the game has already been out in the Humble Indie Bundle 5 or 6 or whatever, and between the daily deals and these flash sales that Steam's been favoring lately, $2.50 seems like an easy price to throw on it. And, like I said, definitely check it out, especially at a low price like that. If I did have to say one bad thing about the game, though, and it's not even bad, I have to stress, but the PC controls, if you're using the keyboard, they're not great. It's not terrible, and you can definitely work around them, but it can be tough. So I would suggest, if you are going to buy it, try to have a third-party controller, maybe, one of those cheap PS2 knockoffs or something. They can be sort of hard to set up, but it's worth it with this game. The keyboard, it's tough. I actually was originally recording this video on keyboard. I just had to stop halfway through, and I bought myself a nice wired 360 controller just so I could better control it for this video. I died twice on that very first segment. The one with the spikes? Yeah, twice. Go ahead. Take the time, move to the beginning of the video, look at the spikes. Ridiculous. Taking some time to get used to it, it's probably workable, but I just figured I'd throw it out there. Some of us are not so keyboard inclined. The best part though is if you are that worried, go find the freeware, try it out. It's not going to look as great, but It's definitely an option. And if the graphics don't bother you that much, stick with the freeware. But for those longtime fans of Cave Story looking for just a little bit of an update, and they haven't necessarily bought it on the Wii, the 3DS, any other platforms, Cave Story Plus is definitely a worthy investment. And for those who haven't necessarily played Cave Story yet, I would suggest checking out the freeware version. Figure out whether the core gameplay is really something you're into or not, and ask yourself what you think of the older graphic style and audio. If that old school charm is really something you enjoy, stick with the freeware version. But if you're looking for a little bit of a more modern experience, I would definitely say go with Cave Story Plus. The best part is though, either way, you really can't go wrong. And here we have Limbo. It's an indie game by developer Play Dead. And I know you're probably thinking, Play Dead? Sounds like it's gonna be kind of a dark game. Well, you'd be pretty right on by saying that. As you can see from the gameplay footage, a lot of the game is black and white and shot through what looks like this grainy filter. And the whole game is overall quite grayscale. Now, as you can see, it's a 2D puzzle side-scroller. So you basically play this young boy, presumably in limbo, but it's really never stated, and you traverse this world environment. You start out in a forest, and as you progress through the game, you come across other environments. Most notably is this industrial sort of dark water world. Sounds like it could be pretty exciting, but keep in mind, this is definitely a slow-paced game. Its puzzles can take a while to figure out, although early on they're pretty easy. One of the things that I didn't really like too much about it is while early on none of the puzzles were exactly mind-bending, later it was more of an issue of trial and error than actually learning some of the mechanics of the puzzles. The way death is handled is also very trial and error. It's not so much you find a new enemy type or a new obstacle, learn how to circumvent it, and move on. You just find a new type, get killed by it, learn that specific area, get by it, but then right after you die to the exact same thing with no real way to see what's coming. There's actually a pretty good example in this video of a bear trap that I believe I let kill me just to show the mechanic. I was aware that the bear trap was there, but if I had never played the game before, it would have absolutely killed me. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but there's nothing that I learned from the experience of dying to the bear trap the first time that allows me to avoid it in the future. I've probably died 10 times to 10 different bear traps during the course of the game. That's not to say the trial and error gameplay is necessarily bad. Plenty of games have done it before in a pretty well-received manner. For example, VVVVVV did it, and it was a lot of fun, but Limbo is a slower-paced game, and it just doesn't work for that slow, methodical, puzzle-based gameplay. It's just makes things more difficult than they have to be. It's a game that, in the end, I was glad that I played, and glad that I beat it, certainly. But as far as recommending it, I'm not sure that I could. At least at the $10 price point. It actually has an 88 Metacritic score, which is quite good, but unless you look at the gameplay and immediately say, wow, that looks like it's certainly up my alley, I would suggest not biting unless it hits something like $2.50 on a daily deal, which is likely to happen. But even then, just know what you're getting into. It's got this slow, nice, puzzly gameplay that's just intermittently chopped up by these strange trial and error death segments. Don't get me wrong, death segments are cool, but it just doesn't work here. And next up on the list, we have a game called NightSky. It's created by a guy who goes by the name of Nifless, or Knifeless maybe, not really sure, who actually now works for Nicalis, of Cave Story Plus fame, of course. So NightSky is really sort of an under-the-radar kind of game. It's not what I would call obscure necessarily, but it didn't really get as much acclaim as some of the other indie games that we'll be looking at. I think some of that is pretty obvious as to why. It's definitely not a bad game, I would say, but the demographic of who this is going to interest is definitely a bit narrower than most of the other indie games we'll be looking at. As I'm sure you can see from the video, the game actually looks a bit like Limbo, just in that it's very grayscale. There's not a lot of color, more than Limbo, for sure, but I think it's definitely important that it be said because there are some similarities. Both games are physics-based puzzlers, and they do share a certain minimalistic tendency as far as their visuals are concerned, but there are definitely a few things that make NightSky stand on its own as a separate entity from Limbo, and vice versa. The one area that really sticks out for me in NightSky, especially in differentiating it from a lot of other games that have come out in the past few years, is its soundtrack. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that the soundtrack is amazing or even good necessarily, but it's definitely different than what we would normally see in a game. I've actually struggled before with how to explain what it is that's so unique about NightSky's soundtrack. It's pretty difficult. It just seems to click with the locales that are explored in the game. If you're in a forest, the soundtrack really makes it seem like you're in that forest. The other thing that I think NightSky does exceptionally well is it knows when to stop putting the emphasis on the soundtrack. There have been plenty of times when I've been playing the game and, for example, it starts raining in an early section, and I start thinking, oh wow, that rain is really loud in comparison to the soundtrack. The music in the background has pretty much disappeared, and I've went into trying to configure the sound options to try and get that soundtrack, that background music back, but it's really not worth it. It's supposed to be made that way, in a way where the music in the background comes in and leaves as is necessary. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, this is obvious. Background music is supposed to be just that, background music. And I get that point of view, but there are a few things that really make me think, well, it's more than that. They're really trying to go for something here. One of them in particular is this focus on sound. And again, yes, we've been talking about sound this whole time, but specifically the in-game sound effects. I wouldn't necessarily call myself an audiophile or anything like that, but the way, and this is gonna sound kind of weird, the way the main character, just this marble, moves around and the little sounds it makes when it bounces off all the different kinds of objects in the game is really just perfect. Now, I've been talking about the sound for a while now, because it really is the high point of the game. The soundscape that they create is really impressive, but on the whole, I'm just not a fan of NightSky. The gameplay works, it's okay, but it never really goes anywhere interesting or new. To get to the nitty-gritty here a little bit, NightSky is $9.99 on a normal day. I figure during the Steam sale, it'll come down to $2.50. It has in the past, it might even be less. Unfortunately though, for most people, I just don't think this game is gonna click. Now, there's definitely a subset of gamers that are gonna be very interested in this title. My guess is, if you've watched the video, you already know if you're one of these people. If you like to sort of take a step back, relax, and just let the game guide itself, well, this could be a title for you. But if not, I wouldn't bother with it. Next up, we're going to be looking at a game called Geometry Wars Retro Evolved. Now, what'll probably be the first thing that's jumping into your head is, oh yeah, I remember that game was released on the Xbox 360 arcade. Well, you're right. And down the line, it actually came to Steam, although probably not in the format that you're expecting. Interestingly enough, Geometry Wars was actually a minigame before it ever got its own release. It was first seen in Bizarre Creations' Project Gotham Racing 2 on the Xbox as a minigame. The minigame was apparently popular, and it later was released on the Xbox 360. And of course, it was later released on Steam. Now, there are a lot of things to like about Geometry Wars, so we'll talk about that before we get into the negative aspects of the game. While it's technically not an indie game, you'd never be able to tell. It's small, it's simple, and it has this retro art style. The game plays a bit like Asteroid. You're a ship, you try and shoot the other ships, and you guys are all shaped like these different geometric shapes. It's a simple presentation, but it definitely looks good. This is all laid out on a grid that serves as the battle arena, for lack of a better term. Most of this you can really just tell from the video that I have posted, but there are some definite downsides that you'd never be able to tell if you just watch the video. The main downside is, basically, that's it. There's no other gameplay. And I know you're saying, well, it's an indie game. It doesn't have to have a lot of gameplay. Just something simple and clean. And it definitely achieves that. But it leaves a bad taste in your mouth. Because if you have any familiarity with the Xbox 360 version of the game, there are a lot of modes included. But here in the Steam release, there's nothing. You hit play game, and you play the game. It's the one map, the one game mode, and you just shoot stuff. Sure, it's fun, but the 360 version has all these different sorts of game modes, all these different maps, and if memory serves me right, there's definitely a clear progression where you're score attacking to unlock even more maps and even more modes. So, even though the game is actually pretty decent, I would really suggest against buying it, even during the Steam sale, where I'm assuming the price could go down to $2, maybe only $1. There are two main reasons that I feel the way I do about this game. First of all, and I think this is important during a Steam sale, we need to step back and ask ourselves, okay, when am I going to play this game? Sure, it could be really fun, and I'm not saying it's not, but a score attack game like this, unless for some reason you really get into it, you're only going to be playing it for anywhere from maybe 10 minutes to a half hour at most. You might be saying, well, Brian, it's only a couple bucks, so what if I don't like it that much? You're right, it's only a few bucks, and in the end, it's a drop in the pail. But are you going to look back on this and say, wow, good thing that I bought Geometry Wars. That was a nice game to have bought, for sure. Probably not. Everyone always whines about that Steam sale regret at the end of a sale, but I think it's important to start thinking about that maybe mid-sale, or even at the beginning of a sale. My other reason is admittedly sort of soapboxy, so I understand if you don't necessarily agree, or if you just want to skip this portion. But I really think it's bad business to put a game on Xbox's Indie Arcade and then port it to Steam with the exact same name, but strip all the features. This isn't even half the features, or most of the features. This is literally everything but the most basic components of the gameplay. And that's understandable if the base gameplay is amazing. Geometry Wars' base gameplay is pretty good, but not good enough to allow me to feel completely okay with buying their game, even though the tactics that they used to get me to buy it were not exactly honest. Alright guys and gals, that's going to be all for today's Indie Retrospective. I hope you enjoyed, and stay tuned for the next episode, which should be out shortly. We'll be looking at Dungeons of Dreadmore, Bastion, and Terraria. Some of my favorite games of the generation. It's going to be a good one. But, thanks for watching, and I hope I see you next time.